Go away, naughty boy. I don't play with boys who can't afford to take a holiday for football any day they like. Miller: Yes, that's just you to at. You'd make it so that no lad whose father wasn't a millionaire could play at all in a really good team. Wrestling: holding opposing players, and carrying the ball were all allowed. Rugby football was thought to have been started about 1845 at Rugby School in Rugby, Warwickshire, England, although forms of football in which the ball was carried and tossed date to medieval times. Old Rugbyans played at Christ Church, Oxford. One observer, Father W. Several of the football codes are the most popular team sports in the world. New Zealand's governing body renamed itself in 2007, saying the international game is called football. Due to its violence, a meeting that year was hosted by American President Theodore Roosevelt led to sweeping rules changes that caused the sport to diverge significantly from its rugby roots to become more like the sport as it is played today. There is evidence for schoolboys playing a football ball game in Aberdeen in 1633. Some references cite 1636, which is notable as an early allusion to what some have considered to be passing the ball. Passing was a regular feature of their style. Etymology. A translation reads, "For as much as there is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large footballs, rage rise de grosses pellets to pee in the fields of the public, from which many evils might arise which God forbid, we command and forbid on behalf of the king, on pain of imprisonment, such game to be used in the city in the future." Page semi-protected. The Maori in New Zealand played a game called Kia Ora, consisting of teams of 7 players play on a circular field divided into zones, and score points by touching the po, boundary markers, and hitting a central tupu or target. Following these matches, organized football in Melbourne rapidly increased in popularity. Citation needed. 1840s, Old Rugbyans v. However, the motion to ban running with the ball in hand and hacking was carried and Blackheath withdrew from the FA. By the end of the 19th century, distinct regional codes were already developing. Gaelic football, for example, deliberately incorporated the rules of local traditional football games in order to maintain their heritage. A pair of football boots were ordered by King Henry VIII of England in 1526. May use football for as much good to the body, by the chief use of the legs. For example, students at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire played a game called Old Division Football, a variant of the Association Football Codes, as early as the 1820s. Australian rules football has the highest spectator attendance of all sports in Australia. Tools. Harrison's committee accommodated the Geelong Football Club's rules, making the game then known as Victorian rules increasingly distinct from other codes. In the mid-19th century, various traditional football games, referred to collectively as Cade, remain popular in Ireland, especially in County Kerry. The Football Association. For my part, I see no reason why the men who make the money shouldn't have a share in the spending of it. 215 AD. North American Football Codes. The earliest historical account is an anecdote from the 1878 book by Robert Brough Smith, The Aborigines of Victoria, in which a man called Richard Thomas is quoted as saying, in about 1841 in Victoria, Australia, that he had witnessed Aboriginal people playing the game. Mr. Thomas describes how the foremost player will drop kick a ball made from the skin of a possum and how other players leap into the air in order to catch it. American football, with 1857, Haileybury School v. Heading from the Sportsman, London, front page of November 25, 1910, illustrating the continued use of the word football to encompass both association football and rugby. In Comrie, several people stand in a circle and kick a ball to each other, trying not to let the ball drop to the ground, much like keepy uppy. An illustration from the 1850s of Indigenous Australians playing Marngrook. See also, Origins of Australian Rules Football. American football still, however, remained a violent sport where collisions often led to serious injuries and sometimes even death. Gaelic football. Each match began with two teams facing each other in parallel lines, before attempting to kick the ball through each other team's line and then at a goal. See also, Apis Kairos and Kuchua. Citation needed. Pasukwakohaug, a game similar to modern-day association football played amongst Amur Indians, was also reported as early as the 17th century. Old Salopians, played at Cambridge University the following year. However, in 1851, Richard Linden and William Gilbert, both shoemakers from the town of Rugby, near the school, exhibited both round and oval-shaped balls at the Great Exhibition in London. University teams to do the same. In Europe, early footballs were made out of animal bladders, more specifically pigs' bladders, which were inflated. A Song Dynasty painting by Sohanshan, c. A player shall be entitled to run with the ball towards his adversary's goal if he makes a fair catch, or catches the ball on the first bound, but in case of a fair catch, if he makes his mark he shall not run. Paint of a Mesoamerican ball game player of the Teppan title murals in Teotihuacan. The oldest football league is a rugby football competition, the United Hospitals Challenge Cup, 1874, while the oldest rugby trophy is the Yorkshire Cup, contested since 1878. C. December 1, 1859, Old Marlburians v. Westminster School. Games played in Mesoamerica with rubber balls by indigenous peoples are also well documented as existing since before this time, but these had more similarities to basketball or volleyball, and no links have been found between such games and modern football sports. It is not certain that the ball was being struck between members of the same team. However, offside laws began to diverge and develop differently at each school, as is shown by the rules of football from Winchester, Rugby, Harrow, and Cheltenham, during between 1810 and 1850. Talk. In 1907, a New Zealand professional rugby team toured Australia and Britain, receiving an enthusiastic response, and professional rugby leagues were launched in Australia the following year. Sheffield F. The code was largely independent of the public school rules, the most significant difference being the lack of an offside rule. He is also the first to describe goalkeepers and passing of the ball between players. There is a reference to "get hold of the ball," suggesting that some handling was allowed. Australian rules football. President Theodore Roosevelt to hold a meeting with football representatives from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton on October 9, 1905, urging them to make drastic changes. A. Within a few years the NRFU rules had started to diverge from the RFU, most notably with the abolition of the line-out. Main articles, Rugby Football and History of Rugby Union. Tom Wills played rugby football in England before founding Australian rules football. 150, c. Early history. They could only dribble with their feet, or advance the ball in a scrum or similar formation. Old Salopians, played at Cambridge University. February 22, 1860, Charterhouse School v. It existed during the Han Dynasty and possibly the Qin Dynasty, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, attested by descriptions in a military manual. Article. The French name and acronym has remained, even outside French-speaking countries. 1 million high school football players and nearly 70,000 college football players, is the most popular sport in the United States, with the annual Super Bowl game accounting for 9 of the top 10 of the most watched broadcasts in U.S. In 1845, 3 boys at rugby school were tasked with codifying the rules then being used at the school. This situation endured until 1948, when at the instigation of the French League, the Rugby League International Federation, RLIF, was formed at a meeting in Bordeaux. Kicking in opposite directions. It is an instrument for the foot and then it is called in Latin pila pedalis, a football. Australia's association football governing body changed its name in 2005 from using soccer to football. Australian rules football. Mahmoud Al-Kashgari in his DWA with Macron and Lughait Al-Turk, described a game called Tapuk among Turks in Central Asia. Although the original dispute between the two codes has now disappeared, and despite the fact that officials from both forms of rugby football have sometimes mentioned the possibility of reunification, the rules of both codes and their culture have diverged to such an extent that such an event is unlikely in the foreseeable future. Sheffield. Main articles: Gridiron Football, History of American Football, and Canadian Football History. In most codes, there are rules restricting the movement of players offside, and players scoring a goal must put the ball either under or over a crossbar between the goal posts. The ball was to prove popular in early forms of football in the U. Each school drafted its own rules, which varied widely between different schools and were changed over time with each new intake of pupils. Oldest known painting of football in Scotland, by Alexander Carse, c. Scoring goals or points by moving the ball to an opposing team's end of the field and either into a goal area, or over a line. Wood engraving of an Australian rules football match at the Richmond Paddock, Melbourne, 1866. There were also rugby clubs in Ireland, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. As was the case in Britain, by the early 19th century, North American schools and universities played their own local games, between sides made up of students. There is archival evidence of football games being played in various parts of Australia throughout the first half of the 19th century. This is the first description of a kicking game and the first description of dribbling. Tee game at which they had met for common recreation is called by some the football game. Before 1850, many British children had to work 6 days a week, for more than 12 hours a day. 1130, 1160, depicting Chinese children playing kazoo. In 1363, King Edward III of England issued a proclamation banning. The game was played primarily during significant religious festivals, such as Shrovetide, Christmas, or Easter, and Shrovetide games have survived into the modern era in a number of English towns, see below. The earliest evidence that games resembling football were being played at English public schools, mainly attended by boys from the upper middle, and professional classes, comes from the Vulgaria by William Herman in 1519. Among his contributions are the earliest evidence of organized team football. Regardless of any form of football, the first international match between the national team of England and Scotland took place at Rayburn Place on March 27, 1871. Common rules among the sports include: in the earliest manifestations of these rules, players were off their side if they simply stood between the ball and the goal, which was their objective. The first 4 rules still contained elements that are no longer part of association football, but which are still recognizable in other games, such as Australian football and rugby football. For instance, a player could make a fair catch and claim a mark, which entitled him to a free kick, and if a player touched the ball behind the opponent's goal line, his side was entitled to a free kick at goal, from 15 yards, 13. Common elements. Further information, football, word. Main article, oldest football clubs. Football was adopted by a number of public schools as a way of encouraging competitiveness and keeping youths fit. Club members: Wills, William Hammersley, J. At the Freemasons Tavern, Great Queen Street, London on the evening of October 26, 1863, representatives of several football clubs in the London metropolitan area met for the inaugural meeting of the Football Association, FA. There is an alternative explanation, which is that football originally referred to a variety of games in medieval Europe that were played on foot. American and Canadian football remain different codes, stemming from rule changes that the American side of the border adopted but the Canadian side has not. Northeastern American Indians, especially the Iroquois Confederation, played a game which made use of net rackets to throw and catch a small ball. However, although it is a ball-goal foot game, lacrosse, as its modern descendant is called, is likewise not usually classed as a form of football. Mulcaster's writings refer to teams, sides and parties, positions, standings, a referee, judge over the parties, and a coach, training master. English public schools. In its place, Two general types of football evolved, kicking games and running, or carrying, games. 1830. In July 1858, Tom Wills, an Australian-born cricketer educated at Rugby School in England, wrote a letter to Bell's Life in Victoria and Sporting Chronicle, calling for a football club with a code of laws to keep cricketers fit during winter. The modern rules of many football codes were formulated during the mid or late 19th century. Similarly, in a poem in 1613, Michael Drayton refers to when the ball to throw, and drive it to the goal, in squadrons forth they go. American football also faced pressures to ban the sport. However, the rules of professional games varied from one country to another, and negotiations between various national bodies were required to fix the exact rules for each international match. The first known codes, in the sense of a set of rules, were those of Eton in 1815 and Aldenham in 1825. In particular, they devised the first offside rules, during the late 18th century. The expansion and cultural influence of the British Empire allowed these rules of football to spread to areas of British influence outside the directly controlled empire. Third, it was teachers, students, and former students from these schools who first codified football games, to enable matches to be played between schools. Ferris described two main forms of cade during this period: the field game, in which the object was to put the ball through arch-like goals, formed from the boughs of two trees, and the epic cross-country game, which took up most of the daylight hours of a Sunday on which it was played, and was won by one team taking the ball across a parish boundary. The demands of a professional league dictated that rugby had to become a better spectator sport. Turkic peoples. Camp's two most important rule changes that diverged the American game from rugby were replacing the scrummage with the line of scrimmage and the establishment of the down and distance rules. View history. In 1610, William Strachey, a colonist at Jamestown, Virginia, recorded a game played by Native Americans, called Pawseyman. Women playing a form of football was first described in 1580 by Sir Philip Sidney in one of his poems, "A time there is for all, my mother often says, when she, with skirts tucked very high, with girls at football plays." By the 20th century, the game had evolved to a more rugby-style game. One of the longest-running football fixture is the Cordner Eggleston Cup, contested between Melbourne Grammar School and Scotch College, Melbourne, every year since 1858. A game known as football was played in Scotland as early as the 15th century. It was prohibited by the Football Act 1424, and, although the law fell into disuse, it was not repealed until 1906. December 19, 1859, Old Harrovians v. The first detailed description of what was almost certainly football in England was given by William Fitzstephen in about 1174-1183. Football was played in Ireland in 1308, with a documented reference to John McCroken, a spectator at a football game at Newcastle, County Down, being charged with accidentally stabbing a player named William Bernard. The separate Lancashire and Yorkshire competitions of the NRFU merged in 1901, forming the Northern Rugby League, the first time the name Rugby League was used officially in England. Main article, Football, word. At the fifth meeting it was proposed that these two rules be removed. American football. Nevertheless, the original text does not state whether the allusion to passing as kick the ball back, repercute palam, was in a forward or backward direction or between members of the same opposing teams, as was usual at this time. The oldest surviving soccer trophy is the Udan Cup, 1867, and the oldest national football competition is the English FA Cup, 1871. It is widely assumed that the word football, or the phrase football, refers to the action of the foot kicking a ball. This further assisted the spread of the rugby game. The young aristocrats of the city would dress up in fine silk costumes and embroil themselves in a violent form of football. Older citizens, fathers, and wealthy citizens come on horseback to watch their juniors competing, and to relieve their own youth vicariously. You can see their inner passions aroused as they watch the action and get caught up in the fun being had by the carefree adolescents. Oxford University. During the 20th century, several of the various kinds of football grew to become some of the most popular team sports in the world. Frank Marshall, an arch opponent of player payments, and James Miller, a longtime opponent of Marshall. 5 meters, in front of the goal line. 6 women were banned from playing at English and Scottish Football League grounds in 1921, a ban that was only lifted in the 1970s. Inter-school sporting competitions became possible. By the 1870s they became the dominant code in the North and Midlands of England. Of the 45 national FIFA, Fédération Internationale de Football Association, affiliates in which English is an official or primary language, most currently use football in their organization's official names. The FIFA affiliates in Canada and the United States use soccer in their names. Main article, Football, Ball. Establishment of modern codes. The first side to play a passing combination game was the Royal Engineers AFC in 1869/70. The game played in the 19th century resembled mob football that developed in medieval Europe, including a version popular on university campuses known as Old Division football, and several municipalities banned its play in the mid-19th century. The Japanese version of Kujua is Kamari, and was developed during the Asuka period. The ancient Greeks and Romans are known to have played many ball games, some of which involve the use of the feet. If any player shall run with the ball towards his adversary's goal, any player on the opposite side shall be at liberty to charge, hold, trip or hack him, or to wrest the ball from him, but no player shall be held and hacked at the same time. Rugby League. Football matched in the 1846 Shrove Tuesday in Kingston upon Thames, England. The first direct reference to scoring a goal is in John Day's play The Blind Beggar of Bethnal Green, performed circa 1600, published 1659. I'll play a goal at Camp Ball, an extremely violent variety of football, which was popular in East Anglia. For example, calcio players could punch, shoulder charge, and kick opponents. The rules of the English FA were being distributed widely. In England, by the 1890s, a long-standing rugby football union ban on professional players was causing regional tensions within rugby football, as many players in northern England were working class and could not afford to take time off to train, travel, play and recover from injuries. Harrow School. The game was not played after January 1739, until it was revived in May 1930. The first international football match took place between sides representing England and Scotland on March 5, 1870 at the Oval under the authority of the FA. Once kept by the Rugby Football Union as an early example of rugby football. The Melbourne football rules were widely distributed and gradually adopted by the other Victorian clubs. Further divergence of the two rugby codes. Richard Lyndon's wife is said to have died of lung disease caused by blowing up pigs' bladders. A running game, resembling rugby football, was then taken up by the Montreal Football Club in Canada in 1868. There are a number of references to traditional, ancient, or prehistoric ball games, played by indigenous peoples in many different parts of the world. Princetown School. The first side to have perfected the modern formation was Cambridge University AFC. They also introduced the 2-3-5 pyramid formation. The first rugby international took place in 1871. Mulcaster's football had evolved from the disordered and violent forms of traditional football. There is no conclusive evidence for either explanation. The first Gaelic football rules were drawn up by Maurice Davin and published in the United Ireland magazine on February 7, 1887. The laws of rugby union also changed during the 20th century, although less significantly than those of rugby league. The boom in rail transport in Britain during the 1840s meant that people were able to travel further and with less inconvenience than they ever had before. Richard Mulcaster, a student at Eton College in the early 16th century and later headmaster at other English schools, has been described as the greatest 16th century advocate of football. In Francophone Quebec, where Canadian football is more popular, the Canadian code is known as LE football, while American football is known as LE football Américain, and association football is known as LE soccer. The Harvard v. McGill game in 1874. By early 1872 the Engineers were the first football team renowned for playing beautifully together. The Cambridge rules differed from the draft rules in two significant areas, namely running with, carrying, the ball and hacking, kicking opposing players in the shins. Ancient Greek athlete balancing a ball on his thigh, Piraeus, 400-375 BC. Main article, History of Gaelic Football. In 1314, Nicholas de Farndon, Lord Mayor of the City of London, issued a decree banning football in the French used by the English upper classes at the time. Apart from rugby football, the public school codes have barely been played beyond the confines of each school's playing fields. In 1966, rugby league officials borrowed the American football concept of downs. A team was allowed to retain possession of the ball for 4 tackles. Rugby union retains the original rule that a player who is tackled and brought to the ground must release the ball immediately. Smaller number with such overlooking, sorted into sides and standings, not meeting with their bodies so boisterously to try their strength, nor should ring or shuffling one another so barbarously. In 1867, Princeton used rules based on those of the English Football Association. C. On November 23, 1876, representatives from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Columbia met at the Massasoit Convention in Springfield, Massachusetts, agreeing to adopt most of the rugby football union rules, with some variations. Modern balls. Rugby union is the most popular sport in New Zealand, Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji. The major impetus for this was the patenting of the world's first lawnmower in 1830. Barlow, Cumberland, Frederick A. These were the first set of written rules, or code, for any form of football. The club, considered by some historians as the first formal football club in the United States, was formed in 1862 by schoolboys who played the Boston game on Boston Common. Two schools of thought developed regarding rules. 1852, Harrow School v. English public schools were the first to codify football games. Main article, Sheffield Rules. The iconic ball with a regular pattern of hexagons and pentagons, see truncated icosahedron, did not become popular until the 1960s, and was first used in the World Cup in 1970. Canadian football then implemented the legal forward pass in 1929. Competitions. Edinburgh Arcade Michael Club. The need for a single body to oversee association football had become apparent by the beginning of the 20th century, with the increasing popularity of international fixtures. Samoa changed from Samoa Football, Soccer, Federation to Football Federation Samoa in 2009. Will Luckby, who had studied at Bishop Vesey's Grammar School, Sutton Coldfield, is the first to describe goals and a distinct playing field, a close that has a gate at either end. Further information, Medieval Football. There is a reference to get hold of the ball before another player does, Prirapi ilipalam si passes agira, suggesting that handling of the ball was allowed. Two teams of usually between 11 and 18 players, some variations that have fewer players, 5 or more per team, are also popular. For specific sports and other uses, see football, disambiguation. A group of indigenous people playing a ball game in French Guiana. All of them declined, except Charterhouse and Uppingham. The earliest known matches involving non-public school clubs or institutions are as follows. Professionalism had already begun to creep into the various codes of football. The earliest known matches between public schools are as follows. Clubs. In New Zealand, football historically referred to rugby union, but more recently may be used unqualified to refer to association football. Medieval and early modern Europe. 1810. Football is a family of team sports that involve, to varying degrees, kicking a ball to score a goal. The South Australian Football Association, April 30, 1877, is the oldest surviving Australian rules football competition. In 1995, rugby union became an open game, that is one which allowed professional players. He said, "Hacking is the true football." At this time, a series of rule changes by both the London and Sheffield FAs gradually eroded the differences between the two games until the adoption of a common code in 1877. A double pass is first reported from Derby School against Nottingham Forest in March 1872, the first of which is irrefutably a short pass. Mr. Absey, dribbling the ball half the length of the field, delivered it to Wallace, who, kicking it cleverly in front of the goal, sent it to the captain, who drove it at once between the Nottingham posts. There have been many attempts to ban football, from the Middle Ages through to the modern day. Ancient Greece and Rome. Globalization of association football. He is the first to describe a law of football: they must not strike an opponent's leg higher than the ball. Roman ball games already knew the air-filled ball, the phallus. The English Football Association had chaired many discussions on setting up an international body, but was perceived as making no progress. Richmond. Other firsts in the medieval and early modern eras. Rugby football split into rugby union, rugby league, American football, and Canadian football. Here pictured in 1857, the year of its foundation, is the oldest surviving association football club in the world. First of all, the evidence suggests that they were important in taking football away from its mob form and turning it into an organized team sport. Football in Scotland, c. The Football League, 1888, is recognized as the longest-running association football league. This allowed for the preparation of modern ovals, playing fields, pitches, grass courts, etc. After the final meeting on December 8, the FA published the Laws of the Game, the first comprehensive set of rules for the game later known as association football. William Webb Ellis, a pupil at Rugby School, is said to have, with a fine disregard for the rules of football, as played in his time, emphasis added, first took the ball in his arms and ran with it, thus creating the distinctive feature of the rugby game. During the second half of the 20th century, the rules changed further. This is considered by historians to be a defining moment in the creation of Australian rules football. Rugby Union. Main article: oldest football competitions. The first football trophy tournament was the Caledonian Challenge Cup, donated by the Royal Caledonian Society of Melbourne, played in 1861 under the Melbourne rules. Carew described how goals were made: they pitched two bushes in the ground, some 8 or 10 foot asunder, and directly against them, 10 or 12 score off, other twain in like distance, which they term their goals. Rugby league rules diverged significantly from rugby union in 1906, with a reduction of the team from 15 to 13 players. This is sometimes said to be the earliest code of rules for any football game. Most often, the word football is used to refer to the code of football that is considered dominant within a particular region, which is association football in most countries. In 1855, some schools favored a game in which the ball could be carried, as at Rugby, Marlborough, and Cheltenham, while others preferred a game where kicking and dribbling the ball was promoted, as at Eton, Harrow, Westminster, and Charterhouse. Although the Rugby School, pictured, became famous due to a version that rugby football was invented there in 1823, most sports historians refuse this version, stating it is apocryphal. Main article: English public school football games. Ancient games. A significant redraft in 1866 by H. The Middle Ages saw a huge rise in popularity of annual Shrovetide football matches throughout Europe, particularly in England. In all codes, common skills include passing, tackling, evasion of tackles, catching, and kicking. Read. Campbell, the representative from Blackheath and the first FA treasurer, objected. Football. The GAA sought to promote traditional Irish sports, such as hurling, and to reject imported games like rugby and association football. References to a ball game played in northern France known as la sole or choule, in which the ball was propelled by hands, feet, and sticks, date from the 12th century. The new body initially permitted only various types of player wage replacements. However, many of them are still played at the schools which created them. See surviving UK school games below. The universities of Yale, Princeton, then known as the College of New Jersey, Rutgers, and Brown all began playing kicking games during this time. Handball, football, or hockey, coursing and cockfighting, or other such idle games, showing that football, whatever its exact form in this case, was being differentiated from games involving other parts of the body, such as handball. However, it was difficult for schools to play each other at football, as each school played by its own rules. Use of the word football. One of the participants in the game involving University of Toronto students was Sir William Mulock, later Chancellor of the school. The game began to return to American college campuses by the late 1860s. After the third meeting, a draft set of rules were published. However, the club initially played